you and I have been told a lie for generations. And in just a moment, I'm going to expose that lie. But if I don't expose that lie, we as a church, we as a community are going to continue to leave a legacy that is not something we want to leave for our children. But before we get there, come back with me. Come back with me to the turn of the 20th century, back to the year 1900. We're going to go to a little village in Italy in a town called Calabria. We're going to meet a man named Francesco. Francesco was sitting in this little piazza looking up at a balcony at a woman named Carmela. Now, Francesco was a common builder at the time, and he was unfit to talk to and associate with a woman of class like Carmela. But despite all odds and cultural pressures, Carmela and Francesco received the blessings to marry. And shortly thereafter, they had their first child, Antonio, in 1906. Then a few years later, Francesco and the Catholic Church found themselves at odds. Now, in Italy at the time, the Catholic Church ran everything. And so Francesco looked at his situation and he decided he was going to set off for America to make a new future for his family. So Francesco set off, and when he landed in Italy, he changed his name to Frank. Frank began to work for 2 years by himself to work up the funds to save and bring his wife and his child to America to be with him. He worked for an additional 4 years to bring his wife's family out to be with him, his wife's mother and her brothers. Now, Frank and Carmela ended up having 9 kids, and most of their children had many, many children of their own. And Frank's family now, to this day, stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. Frank's kids, they were builders, and they were in the building trade in New York City, and many of them built the city of New York from the ground up. Frank has had children that have served in the First and Second World Wars. Some of Frank's kids rubbed shoulders with the New York elite politicians during the Great Depression. And there are streets named after Frank's family, and they're actually in the Chrysler Building, which is one of the most iconic buildings in the skyline of New York City. One of Frank's children actually has his name etched in the concrete of that building. Now, over 100 years, over a century has gone by since Frank set off for America, and he started to build this legacy of his own, and his legacy continues to this day. But the most important part of Frank's legacy, at least to me, is still unfolding here today. Because today, in a church, there are 2 little girls with his last name that are surrounded by a family of people that love them, and they want them to show, and they love them, and they show them the image of Christ every single day. This is Frank and Carmela. And since that time, since Frank and Carmela came to America, they have set apart a foundation, a legacy that I stand on with my girls here today. And if you're wondering, who am I? My name is Jonny, and I'm the youth pastor here at Mountain Ridge. And it is my blessing to bring a story to you today of what God is doing. And we're not here to talk about my family legacy, although that would be fun. No, we're here today to talk about the church family legacy, the family of God, the legacy that He wants for us. Maybe you have a rich family legacy. And maybe it's a legacy that you've heard over and over and over again around the dinner table at Thanksgiving, at Christmas. Maybe it's something that you know backwards and forwards, and maybe your family legacy is something that it seems is more important than the people sitting around the table at the family dinner. Maybe your family legacy isn't exactly something that is celebrated, and it's actually one of those things that's pointed to as a bad example, a cautionary tale. Man, don't live up to your family legacy. Maybe you didn't realize that you had a family legacy. Maybe your family never really talked about its history. But the thing is, every family, everyone has a family legacy. And God's family legacy is His church. See, the legacy of the family of God goes clear back through all of human history. And it focuses primarily on a group of people called the Israelites, the Jewish people. These were the people that God set apart from the beginning of time to be His example to the world, to be His family, to carry on His legacy. Now, God provided for them, and He laid out the plan for them to continue to live in that legacy. And what we're going to talk about today may seem like another one of those youth pastor messages about the youth, or maybe it's going to feel a little bit like a parent message, but it's more than a message to parents. Today's message is a wake-up call to the church. It's a wake-up call saying we have to take our legacy, the legacy of the family of God, seriously. But in the beginning, I told you that we all believed a lie. So what about that lie? This lie is pervasive, and it itself has an over 100-year, century-long legacy of its very own, a legacy that invades all parts of our culture, including our culture here at church. And if the church is going to continue to buy into this lie, then it means that we've settled to become the shameful owners of a broken future. And I don't know about you, but I look out at our community, I look at my girls, and I don't think we can afford to live that way. So, the first part of that lie. The first part of the lie that we often believe is that when a child becomes a teenager, they become a problem. Now, let me ask you this question. For those of you that do have parents, those of you that are parents that have teenagers, when you tell someone that you have teenagers, what is the response? I'm going to guess it's one of three things, and raise your hand if this is you. You tell someone that you have a teenager, and they either roll their eyes, or they do that noise that's like someone poured hot coffee on you. They go, ooh, I'm so sorry. Or better yet, you tell them that you have a teenager and they just start showering you with pity, man. Oh, I'm going to pray for you. I am so sorry for you. Or maybe better yet, you're not a parent of a teenager, but you have little ones running around. And maybe you've heard something of the following, like it sounds like you tell someone that you have kids, like, oh man, little kids are so fun, but just wait until they're a teenager. Now, maybe you don't have kids, maybe you don't have littles or anything, and you just are thinking about one day maybe having kids, or you just are daydreaming about it, and you're talking about it with a family member, or you're talking about it with someone you care about, and you tell them that you're thinking about having kids one day, and they say, man, kids are awesome, and when they're adults, they're amazing, but those teenagers, I don't know about that. See, we've all bought this lie about the teenage years, that there's this attitude that we get, that our attitude is to run, duck, and cover. We get this attitude of back in the Cold War when the atomic bombs were falling on everybody, and we have this attitude that we're going to duck and run and cover and hide, and all we can do during the teenage years is pray that we can get through it. And when we believe the lies, when we believe that we have to run, duck, and cover when it comes to the teenage years, it reveals the second part of the lie that we believe. See, we believe that because the teenage years are such a problem, it takes a unique person or a unique set of persons to manage that problem until the problem is solved. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, Jonny, the teenage years are kind of hard. They're kind of a rough thing to deal with. And it kind of does feel like someone should take over. And let me give you a couple of valid reasons why I hear all the time that people want to get rid of teenagers out of their life or just give them to someone else. First off, teenagers smell. Especially the junior high boys, they have a distinct smell, and Axe body spray is something that I really could care less to smell one more time. Maybe for you, teenagers are someone else's problem because they never listen to you or they actively fight you on everything. It is my firm belief that reverse psychology was actually something that was invented by a teenager's mom who was just staring at the pile of dirty laundry on the stairs saying, please, do this, or just trying to figure out a way, and she came up with reverse psychology to get him to try to put his dirty laundry in the hamper. Or maybe you just don't deal with teens because they are often quick to do really dumb things. One of my favorite examples that I share with students all the time as a bad example of something not to do is something that I did on a mission trip when I was in high school. I did something that I'm not proud of, and I often caution them, don't do this. Do as I say, not as I do. When I was a teenager, full of wisdom, full of hubris, snorted Pop Rocks. Let me caution you, don't ever do that. You will have a little bit of pop, snap, crackle, pop in your head for hours. It is not fun. But I tell you all those things because we look at teenagers and we look at those things and we start to see teenagers themselves as a problem. And we use those things as the defining characteristics of teenage years. And we begin to believe the lie that teenagers themselves are the problems. And when we believe those lies, when we believe that they are a problem and that only special people can handle them, then we end up with adults who in their moments of greatest confusion, in their moments of problems, of everything is going wrong in their lives, we actually are teaching them that they're less valuable. I mean, think about it. When you were a teenager, when you were in junior high or high school, and for some of you that might be a little bit further in the past than others, but when you were there, how confusing was that? How hard was that? If we are telling our teenagers, if we're telling our young people, our next generation, that only special people can handle them, that only the people that are paid to be with them will hang out with them, We're telling them that not only do we want to push them aside, but that they're less valuable than everybody else. We're forcing them to hide their problems. We're forcing them to push away everyone that could help them. I mean, think about it. When little Susie is being told that, you have all these problems, go ahead and go hang out with them over there until this is all done. What we're telling her is that regular people don't want to hang out with her. That the people that we care about, the people that want to be around us, they think that we're less valuable, we're less desirable. And what we're unintentionally teaching our young people is that they're less valuable than the people around them that seem to have it all together. And we wonder why anxiety and depression and suicide are on the rise in our culture. We wonder why we look at little Jimmy and we see him doing all these things that we know he shouldn't be doing. And we're like, man, what the heck? Jimmy was on the path to so much goodness. He was such a good kid until he fell in with that group of dudes. Or maybe it's Lizzie and we go, man, Lizzie had everything for her. She had a full ride. She was going to change the world until she met that boy. Church, we shouldn't be surprised when our young people cling to the people and the movements that make them feel valuable. When families come to me with questions like these and concerns like these, underneath the surface, they're actually all asking the same question. Whether they're dealing with addiction or a problem child or whatever it is, there's actually an underlying question under all of this, and it's a question about legacy. See, we look at our kids, we look at our young people, and we think, man, I had this dream of leaving a legacy with them, of giving them a legacy full of joy, a legacy full of spiritual richness, a legacy where they know who Jesus is, and they know what he's doing in their life. And we look at the legacies that they're choosing for themselves, and we see the pain, the frustration, the devastation of the legacies that they are building on their own, and we get frustrated, and we wonder, what can we do about it? And so how do we fix that? How do we deal with a broken legacy? Well, the answer that we're going to look at today is going to be found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And before we get into Deuteronomy chapter 6, I'm going to give a little bit of backstory so that we are all on the same page. See, Deuteronomy was written by a guy named Moses who was kind of a big deal in biblical times. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah or the Pentateuch. And before we can get into what we're going to look at today in Deuteronomy, we have to know those 5 books at least a little bit. Genesis is the story of creation, of everything being beautiful and perfect until sin and evil entered in the story. And the rest of Genesis is the story of mankind and everything falling away. Exodus is the story of the Israelite people being freed from captivity from one of the most powerful nations in history, and God bringing them out by the blood of the sacrificial lamb. Leviticus is the description of the covenantal relationship that God has for us. It's his way of saying, hey, this is what I want you to look like. I want you to be totally different than every other nation. And I want you to be in a relationship with me, but there's going to be some steps you have to take until I come back to fix it. This is what you got to do to be with me. Numbers is the story of God's provision through the desert, through these 40 years of wandering in the desert where the Israelite people, they had come up to the edge of God's promise. And they had looked at all the good things that God had for them, and they had a little bit of doubt, and they had a little bit of unbelief, and they chose to reject God's promise. And so God said, all right, well, go take a walk. And so they wandered in the desert for 40 years, and every single day, every trial that they experienced, God showed up time after time after time, providing over and over and over. See, Numbers is the story of God showing who he is, that he is a God of promises, that he is a God who provides. And then at the end of the 40 years, the Israelite people come back to the edge of the Jordan, at the edge of the promised land, the edge of the promise that God has for them. And God says, all right, here we go again. Are you guys ready? And Moses, in this book of Deuteronomy, he's going to lay out in the pages before this and after this what they did in the past. So Deuteronomy literally means the second telling. So Deuteronomy is the story of what God has done in the past, and it's the instructions, the vision, the manual for how to continue to live in God's legacy. Because Moses knew one thing. He knew that the only legacy that matters was God's legacy. He knew that the only thing that we needed to care about was God's legacy. And here are, in the passage we're going to read today, are his instructions to his people saying, if you don't do this, if you don't follow these things, it's all going to be lost. Everything we've done, everything we've been through, it's for nothing. Because if you don't take hold of God's legacy, if you don't pour into the next generation like he's going to tell us to do, it means nothing. It's all for a waste. And so with that, we're going to open up our Bibles to Deuteronomy 6, chapter 4. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, pardon me. It's going to be a little bit long one, so buckle up. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your heart and on your gates. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And we're going to skip down to verse 20 real quick. When your son asks you in the time to come, what is the meaning of these testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? So all the stuff before this. Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with a mighty hand. So how do we fix a broken legacy? How do we look at the things that our next generation is doing and fix it? How do we right the ship? How do we get back on course? Moses is telling us two things. We have to love the Lord, and we have to train them up, train up the next generation. And before I get to the train them up, which is a big part of my heart, I have to stop and sit and soak on the love the Lord part. You guys, loving the Lord is the foundation of everything. Any pep talk, any sermon, any message, any tool, anything we could give you here at church or anywhere in the world means nothing if their foundation isn't set. If you don't know the Lord, if you don't love the Lord, if you aren't seeking after the Lord, it means nothing. Guys, if you have not made a decision to follow the Lord, change that. I'm asking you, I'm begging you, nothing else matters until you've made that decision. If you want to talk more about that, hit us up in the chat or connect with us on the app. We have a way to get a hold of that, or just swing by the offices. Again, nothing else matters if you don't love the Lord. All the stuff that we're going to teach you means nothing. The entire Bible is this collection of histories, laws, poems, and eyewitness accounts of God moving in our lives. And Moses is telling us, take it down. Think about it when you rise. Think about it when you lay down. When you're walking about, talk about the stories that are in this Bible. Talk about the Lord. Get to know the Lord. Write it on the doorposts of your house. Put it on your forehead. Put it on your arm. Put it on your dog's fluffy sweater. I don't care. Get to know what the Lord has to say and get to know him. It's the most important thing you'll do for all of eternity. But as we get back to those lies, how does this passage help us fight against the lies that teenagers are the problem and that someone else's problem, or they are someone else's problem to deal with it? I think Moses shows us in this chapter that he had a wildly different perspective on teenagers than most of us do today. A view that we have to adopt if we are going to live in God's legacy, if we are going to continue to leave a lasting legacy. And we have to replace those two lies from before with two truths that I think Moses exemplifies here. So first part is we have to see teens as a wonder to behold and not a problem to be solved. And that's kind of a weird thing, and I know some of you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? What does it look like to look at a teen and be in wonder? Let me give you an example. Instead of writing off teenagers as dangerous risk takers that don't think about anything and they just go off and do whatever they want, what if instead we saw them as a wonder of God to do something different? Before I came to Mountain Ridge, I used to volunteer at a church, and then I became the intern at a church out in California called Bridgeway Christian Church. Fantastic church, fantastic ministry. We had hundreds of kids in the junior high ministry. It was fantastic. But we had this event during the month of November called Servember. We changed the name. It was really fancy. It was really fun. But during the whole month of November, instead of meeting at the church and playing fun games and reading the word here, we actually decided that we were going to go live out our faith. We were going to go out into the community and love our neighbor. And one of these events was called the Rake and Run event. Now, in California, we have these things. They're kind of like cactuses. They're tall, and they have these things called branches. And on the branches, there's these little things called leaves. And in the fall, those leaves fall on the ground, and they blanket everything, and there's leaves everywhere, and it makes a big, big mess. And what we would do is we would take these teenagers, these junior high students, and we would go out into the community with rakes and bags and trucks and all kinds of craziness, and we would go rake up the leaves in the bags and just bless our community, to love our neighbors and show them that we care about them, even in the little ways. I remember one year during the Rake and Run event, there was this boy named Noah. Noah was a risk taker. And I mean that sincerely. Noah was the kind of kid that would dare himself to do something, go do it, just so he could say he did something on a dare. Noah was great. I love Noah. He was a fun kid. But one night during the Rake and Run event, we were out raking up these leaves. I look up and I see coming down the street is an old couple, elderly couple, sweet people. I'm sure that they were awesome people. I didn't get to meet them. But before Noah could do anything, I called him over and said, no, come here. I dare you to go pray for that old couple over there. And Noah, just because it's a dare, he just gets his puffed up chest and says, all right, I'm on it. And he books it over there and he goes and prays for these people. And I don't know what Noah said, but I do know one thing. In that moment, I sat in wonder, in awe of the faith of an 11-year-old boy. I sat in wonder at how he took what was totally foreign to me. At the time, I would not have done that I think I was a 24-year-old guy. I wouldn't have done that. I was scared. And this guy, half my age, went out and he acted in faith and took a risk that I wasn't willing to take. How else can we look at teens as wonders? How else can we stop writing them off as problems and instead seeing them as wonders? Maybe for you see teens as super impulsive. Maybe instead of seeing them as a problem and writing them off as impulsive, we begin to see the wonder that God has made them, that they are uniquely gifted to take hold of this exact moment that God has put them in and do something about it. Maybe instead of writing off teens as emotional, as passion-driven, we instead see them as people who have the heart of God towards injustice, the heart of God towards the broken things. And they are in the unique space of having all the passion and energy it requires to do something big and not many of the things that typically hold the rest of us back. See, how can we repurpose the things that we write off as problems for teenagers and instead view them as wonders to advance the gospel? Treating teens as problems prevents us from passing on a great legacy, from passing on the legacy of the church. And it's going to take more than a handful of people like me and my team to change that. See, training up the next generation doesn't take a special person. And Moses knew that, and I think he's telling us that here in the scripture here today. He's addressing the entire Israelite community. He's not just addressing the people that were set aside to hang out with kids. No, he's addressing everybody in the Israelite community, not just now, but in the future. He's saying, every one of you, all of you, young, old, rich, poor, smart, dumb, good-looking, athletic, does not matter. You are part of this family, so you have a responsibility to pass on the legacy to the next generation. And it takes every single one of us. For us here today, that looks like this. Maybe you are a young person and you're looking at yourself going, I don't know how I'm going to pass on to the next generation. Well, look at the things you do. It takes young people going out and showing the younger generation what it looks like to date as a follower of Christ. They need to know what it looks like to follow his ways in dating. Maybe it takes them going into work and showing what it looks like to be a Jesus follower at work. For an employer that you love or an employer that you don't like. How do you honor Jesus in that? For you parents and grandparents, you have had or are having the unique opportunity, the blessing to train up little disciples right here, right now that are going to have a lasting legacy or live in God's legacy. Maybe you don't have kids or you're an empty nester and you're looking around, you're like, I don't have any young people around me to pour into, John. Well, guess what? You have space, you have resources, you have time, energy, you have things that the rest of us don't have. As a parent, I don't have a lot of time, but I do know that there are those in our community that do have the time, that do have the energy, that do have the resources to build into the legacy that God wants us to live. You guys, the future of the church is a multi-generational and diverse family passionate about passing on the legacy to the next generation. And that's what we're all about in Thrive, by the way. We have everyone from a couple of high school students pouring into junior hires to quite a few empty nesters who take time out of their week, every week, to invest in the students here, to pour into their legacy and build up the church. You guys, you can't let age be your excuse. You can't let that stop you from doing something. Students desperately need someone who's been following Jesus for 20 years, 30 years, 50, 70, 100 years. How crazy would it be to have that for our students? How great of a legacy would that be to pass on, to show them what it looks like to follow Jesus for 80 years? One of the most godly men I knew, one of my favorite guys in the world, his name's John, and it's not just because his name is John. But John Kashak out in California when I was serving in ministry, he was a fantastic man, and I love him to death. But he didn't start serving in ministry until he was 70 years old. This 70-year-old man walked into a room full of 10 to 13-ish-year-old boys and girls, and he stepped into it. And he didn't just stand in the back and go, yeah, man, I'm serving, right? No, he stepped into the fray, and he got into it with these boys. And they loved and respected him, and they learned more about Jesus from that man than they possibly would have ever learned from me staying there. Listen, the world has never needed Jesus, people, more than it does right now. I mean, look around us. Every single person in this church needs to step up and answer the call that Moses is giving to the Israelites at this time. We need to answer that too. We need to step up and raise up the next generation. Handing off responsibility to someone else isn't going to do. That's going to prevent us from passing on a legacy. You don't need any special training. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to know the Bible backwards and forwards. You don't need to be the smartest, the most athletic. You don't need anything. You just need to know and love the Lord, and maybe have one or two tools or tricks in your belt. And I'm going to give you one really easy, simple tool to put in your tool belt right now, and then we're going to send off in just a minute. But if you want to bring up the next verses, we're going to look back at verse 20 to 21. When your son asks you in the time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules of our Lord God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. You guys, the simplest tool in your tool belt is to use this as a template for how you talk about Jesus, or how you talk about your faith. Say to them, we were fill in the blank, and the Lord brought us fill in the blank. Share your story. Talk about where you were, what you were doing, what you were thinking, how you were living. And then God came and changed everything. Jesus changes everything, and tell them how he changed you. And then talk to them about how he is continuing to change you and shape who you are, and help invite them into that conversation about how Jesus is changing them and how he can change them. That tool can be your tool. It's free. Take it and run with it. It's great. It's going to be one of the most effective things you can do is sharing your story, your testimony. It doesn't have to be fancy. Just tell them the truth. I have one last exercise. So you have a couple of questions just to kind of wrap this up. Real quick question. Can you name 5 Olympic gold medalists? What about 5 Academy Award winners? If you're like me, I can name maybe 3. Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt, I guess I can name 2. But let me try this a different way. Can you name 5 people who have had an influence in your life? Can you name 5 people who have impacted your faith? I'm willing to bet that those names came pretty quickly to you. And those names were ordinary names. But those names, those people, they had extraordinary impact on your life. That is what discipleship looks like. That is what pouring into the next generation looks like. It's people that care, people that invest, people that are there. You don't have to know everything. You just have to show up and be present. We have to surround our young people with adults who love them, adults who support them, and adults who teach them the gospel. That is how we leave a lasting legacy. That is how we pass on what God has given us. That is how we go into the future knowing that the legacy that God has given us is going to keep going. You guys, I believe that this community is called to be a people who see teens as a wonder to behold, not a problem to be solved. I believe that this community, it can raise up a generation together that knows and furthers the legacy of God. Mountain Ridge, we can be a church family that the Phoenix Valley looks to and says, man, they're doing it right. They are leaving a lasting legacy. They are passing on what God has given to them. They're doing it right. Pray with me.